Thank you very much for joining today's webinar presentation. The Learning Communities Resource Center really sees itself as a learning hub for the network, and we enjoy the opportunity to facilitate the various national webinar series presentations to just maximize access for our network to the various promising practices and resources available to our network. So thank you again for joining us, and we're just going to dive right on in and basically say that, so yeah, we're serving as this learning hub, where we provide the resources and the information so that ultimately, as a network, our capacity is increased so that we can increase our ability to fight poverty more effectively. So ultimately it's about addressing the causes and conditions of poverty, because anti-poverty work rests at the center of who we are and what we do as a network. And so with this in mind, let's take a moment to ground ourselves in the Community Action Promise. And it basically says, community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. And so with that said, that's why we host this series, and this is one of many that we hope you will take advantage of, and access to the recording for today's presentation as well as past presentations are available on the partnership's website at www.communityactionpartnership.com. So let's just take a moment then to reflect as we ease our way into today's presentation. We can all acknowledge as a network, as I said earlier, that anti-poverty work rests at the center or the heart of what we do. And if we're not mindful about engaging in innovative and promising practices that move families and individuals out of poverty, in some ways we're not effective as a network. In the same way that we must be mindful of what we do as a network, we also need to be mindful of the how we do this work. And it really connects us, the how connects us to our performance management and effective management practices. A key aspect of our performance management framework is our Roma Next Generation framework that suggests that we are engaging with the results-oriented management and accountability cycle on an ongoing manner at every level of the agency's operations. Another key aspect of the Roma Next G concept is our national theory of change, which is really an articulation of our underlying beliefs as a network and our assumptions that guide our service delivery strategy. The national theory of change identifies the why and the how of the activities undertaken, and it identifies the what, or change and an improvement to be produced. And so ultimately, the national theory of change makes what is a complicated system easier to understand, and it really unifies the work of our network, and it articulates our core principles and identifies our national goals. And this national statement can be adapted for specific local needs and approaches by local community action agencies, which ultimately brings us to our conversation today. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the Futures Project, but if we look at the next slide just for a little more perspective, I want to say that the national theory of change is really the focal point or the North Star as we think more specifically about local assumptions, performance indicators, and strategies. Our big goals remain the same, and that is individuals and families with low incomes are stable and achieve economic security. Communities where people with low incomes live are healthy and offer economic opportunity, and people with low incomes are engaged and active in building opportunities in communities. So for those who are interested in learning more about the National Theory of Change, you can see the graphic there, as well as a little bit more. We'll go to the next slide about our about creating local theories of change, and then next slide, more about our national performance indicators, which are contained in our CSBG annual report modules 3 and 4. All information pertaining to this guidance can be found at NASCAS, the National Association of Community Service, I'm messing up. Programs, community service programs, thank you, Zandy. But NASCAS, as we call them, on their website at www.nascas.org, and so hopefully you'll take advantage of those resources and also take advantage of the wonderful series of webinars that they're facilitating in collaboration with our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence this month. So you can just check out the website and you'll be able to find all that information there. And so with that said, which I said a whole big mouthful, the Futures Project itself is a collaborative initiative equipping community action agencies in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington to tell their collective story of how they're building a new future for people affected by poverty. Community action agencies, as we know, change lives, and really the Futures Project believes that using data and a common language to tell our shared story can advance the clarity, impact, and performance of the work to strengthen communities and prepare people to exit poverty. And so as a result of today's presentation, you'll have an opportunity to learn more practical examples on how to better link outputs with outcomes in their efforts to form a more common language and story to make outcomes more meaningful to funders and stakeholders. Today's presenters will explain the work moving through the three-state network. And so the final thing that I would like to share with us related to this is we have this wonderful opportunity for the Futures Project to really show us an example or to model for us what this local approach might be as we're thinking about theories of change, and then everything that follows in that whole performance management process. And it's really, today's presentation is really intended to supplement a larger conversation that we are having as a network regarding our performance management framework and our annual report and our national performance indicator data. So what you will hear today should very much relate to that, but it's not a replacement for that, really intended to be a supplement and to offer us some more perspective on what that could look like in a local scenario. And it also intends to offer our network additional resources that we can use when we're thinking about local strategies and data collection efforts. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters who are really going to be talking about the what, and I'm pleased to introduce presenters Kim Tully and Dr. Brent Ryan Pav, who will tell you a little bit more about themselves and lead us in the remainder of today's presentation. We thank you very much for your attention, and I am passing the baton over to today's presenters. Thank you all for joining us today. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. My name is Kim Tully, and I'm with Solid Ground, a community action agency in North Seattle and North King County.
And hello, everybody. My name is Brent Ryan Pav, and I am the Research and Evaluation Lead with the Prosperity Agenda that's based in Seattle. and we have been managing the Futures Project and are excited today to present some of the what and even some of the why and maybe some of the how as we move forward. So what are we going to be talking about today? What is on the agenda? We are going to actually build off of the first webinar talking about the theory of change for futures and provide you some of those highlights, and then talk a little bit about outputs and outcomes. How are they different, and how does this data turn to information tell a story? And then what are these 13 dimensions of poverty, and how do they get intertwined with a learning community on the local level? And then we're going to finish up talking a little bit about how we can apply the Futures Project in local and regional CAP agencies and go by the stance of learning by doing, and end up with a really great example of how this all can be applied in a local community. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why futures. Why the Futures Project? Well, I mean, easy answer is that there's a need for it. The idea here is that there are pressures going on in the current situation right now, that there are funding cuts, and there is a really big increase in wanting to be accountable for what programs are successful and what might need modification. So the need for continuous improvement on a local level is pretty important, and not only through this aspect, but that it can also allow for greater communication. Not only can we identify what's successful and what's not successful, or what might need modification, but we are able to communicate. We're able to communicate this all on and bring dialogue to the table, and have this information be passed on to people who may not necessarily be knowing, people in the community, people even within the organization, as we'll find out, and also support the Roma process, the Roma cycle as well as align it with the national performance indicators. And so the goal of the Futures Project is really to exit people out of poverty permanently, and really to have a greater understanding of what services are successful. But it's not necessarily just thinking about what's successful, what do I think is successful? It's really bought in by validated research and, hearing the voice of people in the community, in the organization, and also understanding it through outcomes, measurable outcomes, and not necessarily outputs. We're going to talk a great deal about that today, and definitely differentiate the difference between outputs and outcomes. But through these measurable outcomes, we're able to assess which programs have been proven to be really successful and which ones, again, may need some modification. But first, let's talk a little bit about the partnership of the Futures Project. We talked a little bit about this in the previous webinar, but it gives a good climate for talking about as we're moving forward. It was formed in 2014 between three-state CAP it's a three-state CAP collaborative between Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho, which encompasses 53 CAP agencies, 3 CAP associations, and 3 state agencies. And so the partnership is governed through a steering committee, and from each state there's representation from an executive director of one CAP agency, and then one CAP state association board chair, and at least one state CSBG lead staff. So this governing body, this steering committee, has been integral in talking about the understanding of local theory of change, as well as implementing the pilot in the last 6 months. But first, we really wanted to talk and revisit the futures theory of change, and that's what you're viewing right now. And at the very top, you can read it saying that increasing stability and creating community pathways out of poverty. That's really, the end goal of what Futures is trying to do. But you'll see at the very top part of the page, you'll see healthy individuals and families. The idea here is that we're trying to move people towards securing their basic needs, but then equipping them to exit poverty over time. And you're going to see these ovals underneath, and these are actually what we refer to as dimensions of poverty. And we're going to talk a little bit later about that. So I'm just going to state right now that these dimensions of poverty are really a framework in moving individuals and families towards leveraging resources, having the resources and feeling stable. And then on the bottom part, we're seeing healthy communities. So we're seeing this interrelation that it's not just healthy individuals and families alone that are important, but it's also these healthy communities having a shared vision with your community, the agencies having the shared vision and engaging community members, but also being able to know how to leverage the resources, bring about a greater sense of buy-in and perhaps a greater sense of communication and perhaps even local system support. And all of this together can provide for change. And so that is a big part of Futures, is change. The understanding that we all need improvement to some degree. Nobody's perfect, and if we were perfect, then there would be nobody in poverty to some extent. So the idea here is that it takes a community and it takes local on the local level, and not only on the local level, but absolutely on the national level as well. And so that is the idea behind the Futures theory of change. But again, to reiterate, this idea is about changing attitudes and practices towards those experiencing poverty, and realizing that it does take community in order to do that. Our local the Futures theory of change is really focusing on individual and families first, because that is the area, when we're talking about the dimensions of poverty, are integral to the success of people moving forward, and really reflective of all of the unique CAP agencies, community action agencies and councils that are able to really feel that they're answering the needs of their community. Now, it's also important to be thinking about strategy and how do we inform decision-making strategies. Well, that's a big part of today's talk, is talking about data, outputs, and what are outputs, and is that good enough? Is that what we want? Or do we want to go towards relational data, going towards the aspects of outcomes? And so we know that in order to improve, you need dimensions of, changes over time, over direction, over status, and that these are very important in being able to assess if things are becoming better or positive or moving in the right direction. And so this also fits into the aspect of goal-oriented relationships rather than transactional service. So transactional service meaning more like outputs, having numbers, how many people are participating in an employment program, how many people are receiving food boxes on a monthly basis, more like for goal-oriented relationships, that it's relational in the sense that over time is how we can really assess, if things are improving. And we saw the national theory of change earlier on, and the idea of how do CAP agencies fit within the national network. The Futures theory of change is really, again, aiming at starting with the individuals and families in the framework of the 13 dimensions first, but doing this in a way that we are able to look at a process and look at the change in outcomes, but then not only just having them, but being able to test them with specific indicators that aren't very different to what's already being collected, and then using them for continuous improvement. We're going to talk a little bit more about continuous improvement, having a learning community, being able to have a conversation and dialogue where we're all on the same page in Region 10. The idea of having a holistic approach to be able to, again, have a dialogue so we all know what we're referencing, because we know that it's very complex. Poverty is complex, that there are different aspects of poverty, and being on the same page can actually help us move forward and have conversations with one another, and then tell a compelling story, being able to tell a compelling story. So the question might be, why a single theory of change for futures between Washington State and Oregon and Idaho? Again, we understand that community action agencies are very unique in the needs that they're assessing with their communities. And with that, that's really important. The idea of being able to accurately assess the need of one's community. Being in a rural area or being in an urban area, you might think that there might be different needs. But the idea here, again, is being able to have a holistic approach, being able to have that clarity of purpose, being united in the sense of what is success, and then being able to move change forward where we can actually talk about change, as well as how do the community action agencies fit into the national network. So talking a little bit about the supplementing from the national theory of change, the idea here is on the local level, you know, being able to see this uniqueness, but also feel as though we're part of a bigger, clearer purpose in that sense of exiting people and equipping people out of poverty. And so how does a community action agency discover its role? Well, we're really going to be focusing here on converting data into decision-making strategies. Converting data, knowing your data, and then being able to convert that data into outcomes or outputs into outcomes can really add to informing where an organization wants to go forward, where you're really having your huge successes, or where maybe you might want to be reallocating resources in the next year or in the next quarter. But how do you do that? You know, how do you do that? I mean, we are asked to have outputs, and we're under pressures of reporting certain types of outputs that some may believe are different from what the community is necessarily needing. So here is a sense where it allows, well, Futures is a place where individual agencies are allowed to assess that and reflect on that with these 13 dimensions of poverty that we're going to be talking about shortly. And so we're moving, in order to go there, we need to kind of differentiate between outputs and outcomes. Outputs and outcomes, we hear about this all the time, right, Kim?
You know, the interesting part is that we have been moving, most of us know that our funders and community leaders have often been pushing us to move and be a little more, I guess, a little more depth between providing service on an outcome basis or an outputs basis versus developing outcomes that we can then see or making changes in community. And as we look at like the new NPIs, we're looking at outcomes that are identifying and preparing us to be able to talk about shortly creating community impact statements and how are we making impacts on a community level. And so it's a progression that we've been on that track for, and we are looking to see how we're actually impacting individuals and then collectively whether we're changing the resource availability for people in our community.
And so we already know that we're collecting all kinds of data, right?
Yes, all kinds of data.
All kinds of data. And we know that data is important.
Data is critical. A lot of people place a lot of value in the way that they validate things based upon what they consider to be quantitative data.
Quantitative data. So let's dive a little bit deeper here into talking about the differences between outputs and outcomes. So here, outputs, or what I'm referring to as data, are the activities of a program or service. They're singular numbers, and they're from one point in time for the most part. They are just numbers, and they're able to show, you know, who's participating, who's not, how many of a certain quantity are being produced or utilized. And then the question is, but is it just about knowing about these numbers or these outputs good enough? is that a way of showing improvement? Is that a way of knowing how is that a way of knowing how you should be improving or not? And so outcomes, on the other hand, are looking at these numbers, but looking at them through changes. And these can be different changes, but changes that are observed or reported after participation in a program or a service. So outputs are simply just data numbers, single points in time, but outcomes is relational data. It's looking at that change from one point to another. And so this can be done through changes over time. So if you're looking at, differences of something or a measurement from March all the way to December, you can see if things have increased or decreased. We can see that there are changes over status, maybe perhaps in housing, or we're seeing more people in crisis at one point, but then they're moving after a time to thriving. Changes in direction, goal-oriented behavior, in the sense where, if you're achieving a goal even further, then you're moving in a positive direction over a certain extent, or you might be going, regressing from your goals. Or maybe you're just staying the same. Maybe you're just neutral. What do you think?
A key piece of the difference between outputs and outcomes that we're also being asked to further examine and have the skill set to look at is whether we're actually the true impact of an outcome. We may have changes that happen within the status of the lives of the people we work with, but we may not know whether we're actually the key factor that's making that change possible unless we do a deeper conversation and spend time looking at how a collective set, for instance, of services, some people have bundled services, for instance, is to be able to sit down and truly pick apart, what is it for this particular family that actually moved them, which we all know families and individuals all have customized type needs for the reasons why they are in poverty or that they have difficulty exiting out to be a stronger community participant.
And so now enter these 13 dimensions of poverty.
Yeah.
These things that have been referenced earlier on. People are like, what are these?
I try to demystify them. So one thing I can say is that in my agency, for instance, we have a multitude of funding sources, and we have many, many funder-driven or indicators that we respond to based upon those funders' criteria. And while that's very important, we also have and need a framework for ourselves to look at what we do as an agency and be able to talk about it at a level that's above and beyond any individual funding stream or initiative. Because as most of us, I think, our CSBG funding, while it's critical and it is our identity as a community action agency, it may not be the most significant funding source that we have. And so I know we were looking for sort of a core foundational anchoring type way to look at all the work that we do, so we can start to begin to share that, and that compelling story includes many things, whether they're funded by an individual agency, state, federal program or not. So that's why I'm excited when the 13 dimensions were created.
And they weren't just created out of thin air.
Oh, no.
They're grounded in really amazing research through Oregon State University and in collaboration with the Community Action Partnership of Oregon, CAPO. They went out and they listened and they did research and they tried to hear, what are these areas that are really affecting people in the tri-state area here in the Pacific Northwest. And so really they were developing these statewide indicators and trying to see where's this commonality between all of this. And they went rural and they went urban. They tried to have a wide breadth of perspective in order to really be able to pinpoint these dimensions, because it was about being able to not only have continuous improvement, but also being able to tell a collective story. Again, I say coming to the table, having a dialogue, but it is grounded in the research from Oregon State University.
And I know in looking at models, there's various types out there. We have used in some of our grants, for instance, a self-sufficiency matrix for looking at the areas and the components of someone's life, and we've looked at overall themes and initiatives in our community, for instance, on lack of affordable housing, for instance, or identifying transportation issues. And so we've looked at them from what you would call sort of the 60,000 foot, which I would look at these dimensions as categories of sort of genres of service, and looked at them from that standpoint down to, well, what data do we collect right now in regards to that we could share with community members or share with our donors or share with other partners we want to partner with. And so the one thing that I know is, as the sort of the data administrator of my agency, is that I have people, if you look at those 4 quadrants there, I have people who spend most of their time, their lens that they look at their work through is in those categories. So I have people who are big vision thinkers and they want to think on a perspective of individual initiatives like that. And then I have people who are like, I need to understand what would change look like there? What's an indicator that we're actually moving the dial? And people who are at the direct service level who say, I collect data from real people every day, and here's the situations we see, and here's the work that we do to try to fit that. And so what we know is that data is information, and it's information in many different sub-levels, and that it requires us to make sure that it's one, as this is, business practice, best practice, or research-driven, but also then where some of this information and thinking is happening within a multi-level organization in order to improve it.
And so then, what are these Future's 13 dimensions of poverty? And again, this isn't an inclusive list, but according to the research, these were the areas that were pinpointed as being really emphasized in influencing people and being able to be measured in a way that could view impact. And so the idea here is that not every CAP agency, not every community action agency is going to be reflecting all 13 dimensions of poverty. I mean, each agency is maybe producing or focusing more on housing and education and maybe income, whereas another agency is looking at food and nutrition and financial resilience and legal status. But the idea here is that we are having a commonality in these dimensions, and that we're measuring them the same way, in so that if you are measuring similar, or if you are focusing on some of these different dimensions similarly, that you could have a dialogue and you could have a conversation, and you would be able to see how things are improving or to see how your success is. And so also these are the ovals that were in the theory of change, the futures theory of change that that are labeled there. But there are 13 here, and incorporated in different ways, because we know that CAP agencies are unique. They have unique communities, and they are having unique efforts. But here's the case that if you do have similarity there, that you are measuring them the same way. And so we should also say that these 13 dimensions of poverty all have indicators attached to them as well. And these can absolutely be seen in the OSU report that is made public as well. I think there was a question in the last webinar about this, but the idea is that they have indicators that are helping making the measurement to see these outcomes with these 13 dimensions of poverty.
And I think that data, as we look at it, and these 13 dimensions, we were looking at, like I said, a way in which to look at all the programs we have. We have probably 25 plus programs, and if you look at the 13 dimensions of poverty, the nice thing about it, like I said, is at the organizational level, almost every program and director could see themselves in it. And that's a framework then that you can develop, get support, and start to then create a culture in which you're talking from a consistent framework together. But we know that data is just a piece. Data is just a part of the ability to tell a powerful story. And that story could be an individual's story, it could be a group of people's story, or it could be a sector of your community that is not being served. And that in my previous position, I have been a grant writer, and I know from a fund development perspective that there's a very strong anchoring that is in data and, like I said, quantitative results. But the narrative around people's lives and how people's lives change, the qualitative data, is also key to really being able to bring people, all people in your community, along. And when we're talking about the area under community impact, when we talk about trying to change attitudes and change the way in which people perceive the poor within their community, we need to be able to look at all of the holistic pieces and engage people and try to make aware people in the community that we want to have them help us in creating change. And so we know that data is an element and that it's not the whole thing.
So how do you use this data? How do you use this data to tell a compelling story? You know, how do we do this? You know, how, and adding another layer, how are you able to tell a compelling story to funders or to stakeholders or to even your own community? Well, a way of doing this is by transforming those outputs into outcomes. So having that ability and doing that internally within your organization is a very powerful tool. It's a powerful process because it allows for that information to be converted into knowledge, being able to be converted out there and being shared among your community, which can absolutely add to community buy-in and assistance.
I think one of the pieces that, so I am a Roma certified implementer. Washington State itself went through a project where they identified and worked with the national organization to allow nonprofits that may not be in a position to have or pay for a certified Roma trainer to have staff be able to go through a certification process to become a Roma implementer. And so as the Roma implementer in my agency, one of the big questions that kept coming up over and over is that when you look at the Roma cycle and all of the phases of Roma, there's always a conversation about, but how do we embed this down to every level of the organization? How do we take information from the programs and change it from looking at outputs or reporting outputs or beginning to report specific outcome measurements that may be coming out of HUD or collective homeless network? How do we take that and actually do the analysis? Analysis as sitting down and talking through information. Does it say to you what it says to me? What are the factors that aren't here? Like, what do we know other than this raw data? What is the context of it? What's the texture of the environment of the program that we're looking at? And that work, to be honest, in my agency has been, as maybe most, program by program or maybe programs by category like housing or energy programs, those types of things where the work may be done in a small group of people who are very close to the work, but not necessarily on an organizational level, or that the interpretation of it has come to some kind of consensus where we're all pretty confident that we know that it's saying this and therefore we need to probably change our service or our service delivery method or those kinds of things. And so I think one of the things about the Roma implementation to a deep dose within the organization was the fact that we really hadn't spent the time, and we really weren't schooled, I think, on the skill sets necessary to really engage people all throughout the agency levels to come up with our understanding of what the information was telling us so we could make better decisions together. And that is the Futures program, the Learning Community program, was really vital to us to actually be able to, I think, get there to where we're actually functioning in a Roma quality assurance sense.
So bringing these different perspectives to the table were pretty important, right?
It takes everyone who touches information and data, and we use data like it's math. And the truth is it's really collections of information. Like I said, it's internal information we know. It's sometimes external factors happening in the community, but it's all needed to come together. And many people have different lenses they see that information through, depending on where they are working within one organization or within the community.
And so coming from there, we're looking at the idea of perspectives. And so gaining different perspectives were very important in collecting information and important data and moving forward with this project. And so my background is I'm actually an anthropologist. So I really enjoy hearing perspectives of people from everywhere, from all aspects of the world. And so when I was, hearing that we're going to be gaining breadth of perspective from 6 different sites, I thought this would be really fascinating in the sense, and the information was really interesting. So the Futures Project visited 6 different community action agencies and councils in the states of Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And in this process, we visited 2 in Washington State, 2 in Oregon, and 2 in Idaho, both rural and urban areas. And during this time, we had meetings with 6 different directors or executive directors at each site, roughly around 30 interviews with mid-level management, and up to 50 or 60 focus groups and interviews with frontline staff who are working directly with community members. And so after visiting and having all-day site visits at these sites, we were able to come back and take the data and take that information and analyze it into what we call personas. And what are personas? Personas are it's a way of compiling all of those interviews and focus groups into information that can show different types of trends within an organization. And the aim and the goal of these is to actually reduce stereotypic thinking and build empathy. And you're probably thinking, well, we work with people with poverty every day. We don't need to build empathy. We have empathy. The idea here, though, is being able to take a step back and gain breadth of perspective from people you may be working side by side with, or people who you do work daily with, but they share a different perspective. And so that's exactly what we did after analyzing, and we came up with 3 different personas within the CAP agencies that we had visited. And the first persona that came up is Carol the caseworker. Okay, so Carol is not a real person, but Carol's perspective is very, very real, very real. And, Carol is somebody who works on the frontline staff. She's working directly with clients, and she may be quoted to be saying, people in need should be seen as human beings, end quote. Being seen as human beings. The idea that, here's a case where we can hear the need of people who are working on the front line, who are working directly with people who are in crisis. And the idea here is what we heard, one trend was, where does all this data go? They're responsible for not only talking directly with people, but then they're supposed to take this information and put it into this vast system that the perspective was, where does that data go anyway? I don't know really why I'm collecting all of this data. I'm by the way, I'm like super busy entering this information now because I'm dealing with people in crisis every day. And so because of that, I'm not really seeing the relevance in having data. And then what does Carol want? Carol wants, she wants more time with my client, so, she can have less time entering data. She remembers the day where, or he remembers the day when he had 80% of his time was talking to clients and 20% entering data. And now they're feeling frustrated because, now it's flipped. Now it's 80% of the time entering data and 20% listening and building relationships with clients. So the idea of Carol is very, very real, and that perspective is very real. Another trend is Megan the manager. Okay, and so Megan, again, is not a real person, but Megan's perspective is very real. And so Megan is responsible for taking that data and analyzing that data and cranking out some reports. And these reports are full of outputs, and they have outcomes in them. Megan would be quoted as saying something like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We should start connecting the dots instead. So we heard frustrations about, I have 20 databases that I'm dealing with. I'm pulling data with, or 1 to 20 databases. I have dealing with duplicate data all the time. Is the data accurate? Or she's saying, I'm not sure funding requirement outputs show the real need in my community. Or what about, we have too many databases that require inputting the same data. How about consolidating that? Or, I wish we could show the community to the extent of our success. The level of maybe not even knowing if the community that you're working with even knows the level of how much you're really impacting the community. And some of her wants are, I want a clear picture of how our programs are succeeding and where they need to improve. And perhaps throw in some data quality tools. That might be helpful, to help determine outcomes from our outputs. Very concerned about those differences. And then last but not least, we've got Dina, the director. And Dina is, she knows that they have success. She knows that they're very successful in her agency. And she knows that there needs to perhaps be some improvement, because everybody, could utilize some improvement. Nobody's perfect. But then, how do you do that? How do you do that? And some of her pain points are, I wish I could see how all our programs are measuring up. How are the programs measuring up? I know they're doing well, but it'd be nice to actually see how they are over time. And sometimes she feels like, programs might be a little bit siloed or disconnected, bringing those programs together. Some, of her wants are, again, better tools, maybe to show the agency's outcomes quickly and consistently, maybe to be able to pull that information so when she has or he has a meeting with, a legislator, that they're going to be able to have that information and show, what the community really needs in a very quick way. Or even improved communication with funders and stakeholders. That idea of being able, again, to pull that information very quickly or have that would be very useful. And so from these 3 different personas, again, Carol, Megan, and Dina aren't real, but they're very real perspectives that we see or that we saw throughout the CAP agencies in this pilot, that there is learning going on, that there's learning on different levels within the same agency, and that this, the same agency, it's so important to bring those perspectives on the table and to understand and be able to have a conversation about them in order to understand what is the next, how does that inform moving forward in a positive way. So
I think that all of that information and research really grounded what I think many of our community action agencies, and I know my agency, has been feeling, which is the quality assurance aspects of using ROMA, the ways in which the national performance indicators and other funder performance measures are looking, is trying to create a learning environment so that we can build in and actually be experiencing in the work that we do a learning type approach to all these expectations around data. And that we respect the fact that those different personas are representing different ways in which staff will buy into creating data structures, the way in which they will feel heard and be able to participate, and that's vitally necessary to actually be doing the ROMA work throughout the agency, but also developing the skills and the dialogue through those critical lenses to be able to create better outcomes and recommendations for changes for programs. And so it starts to roll in to me as a tool for the process of actually embedding, working, and turning our culture into a way in which we're actually functioning naturally, in a way in which we're learning, sharing, talking about what we're seeing, and coming up with what I consider a better product because of the consensus of us agreeing on, yeah, we think it says this, and we think that either funders know this or they don't know it, but we now have the data to support it, and let's bring that conversation to see if we can either change the way funding happens locally or change the approach or attitudes towards the work, and it just creates a better, richer set of information that data is a part of.
And so building this continuing learning process is really contingent on having the same language in the sense of these 13 dimensions of poverty. So that framework of having those 13 dimensions and knowing those outcomes, but then coupled with having diverse representation of perspective coming to the table to have that dialogue, helps with informing going and moving forward with that continuous learning process. So involvement of staff on the front line, involvement of mid-level managers and of directors and EDs, having you all coming together and communicating in a sense where it can provide and talk about data and talk about maybe even pain points or even, about outcomes, talking about the outcomes and how this can better meet the needs of your community in moving in a positive direction. Also to talk about this, and we haven't really said so much about this yet, but that the futures indicators are actually pretty aligned already with the national performance indicators and with the ROMA cycle. So we already have some that are actually identical, and so it's not, you're already collecting some of this information. What's really neat, though, here is that the 13 dimensions allow you or each individual local CAP agency to pick other areas of measurement that you feel are also very reflective of your community and also do that. And that can also be reported to a higher level, and that can also provide change in knowing how your community really needs.
Yeah, one thing that I know for sure is that my agency, which I can only speak for mine, is adamantly independent as well as collaborative, and that we want to be able to tell our story and have the flexibility to keep our individuality as an agency and what we do and our mission and our values, and at the same time be able to tell the deep story about poverty. And so that's where I see the alignment along with the flexibility in the 13 dimensions.
And so we thought, how do you apply futures at the local level? How are you going to do that? And so we have Kim here today who's going to shed really awesome light on, with her experience with the Futures Project and in her organization.
Right. So I was asked to sort of what I call test drive the 13 dimensions and the learning community approach within my organization. Solid Ground is a CAP agency. We serve King County. We're one of 5 community action agencies in King County, which includes the city of Seattle and many other cities of size, and some very rural parts of the community as well. And we are, like I said, we're a relatively large organization in that we have multiple programs. Many of them are consistent with what community action agencies do, like we do housing and homeless services, and we are the metro transportation for people with disabilities. We also are the host for 28 food banks in the city of Seattle, and we do a number of things that many of you probably do. We also, in some ways, don't do some specific programs like weatherization or early Head Start, so we do have some uniqueness to us in that way. And we have about 280 employees, of which about 125 of them are actually metro drivers, and so they're very distinct in our employment. But that's about our size. And we have some complex needs when it comes to information, and as you can imagine, we're in a very fast-paced environment and a very fast-growing part of the country, and so we have challenges in regards to resources in our community, like affordable housing and other things. And so I was asked to sort of apply and see whether it worked for us, and one of the large tasks that we have between now and October, of course, is to look at the previous NPIs and then look at the new NPIs and try to determine whether we're going to report the same, whether there's opportunity to report more of what we do, and what would that potentially look like. And so we went through the process of identifying one department because we didn't think we could look at it all, and we chose homeless housing, our housing department, which includes multiple programs. And we chose to try to represent those personas in a group of people that would then go through the process of using the learning community to look at their data. And one of the things that we wanted to do was, before we just presented these 13 dimensions to this department of about 50 people, we decided to ask them a question, an open question. You know, what is it that we see ourselves in our community specifically that people either need support in or may have resource challenges to help them transition out of poverty. And so we had a pretty extensive dialogue about that. We actually presented it in the form of a training where we just put things on flashcards with the dimension, and then on the back it had all the indicators that are included with them, and asked them to just identify the top 4 or 5 that resonated with the work that they did specifically. And in that process, like I said, we had housing counseling coordinators that work specifically in our Journey Home program, which is a rapid rehousing model. We had a manager that looks at homeless prevention services that also manages our tenant counseling services. We have a reverse mortgage program, and we're also a hub or a processing center for people who want access to resources within the community. And so in looking at the housing specifically, we try to align that with where is this fit between what we know we already do, which are national performance indicators, and this sort of relatively new concept of a framework of the 13 dimensions of poverty. And so there's actually 19 indicators that are identical, that center of the sphere there. And most of them are in pretty significant areas of service: housing, employment, education, income, transportation. So we had identified that let's just start with the areas where we were already reporting under the National Performance Indicators and look at how we might use 13 dimensions of poverty and the learning community approach to try to see how it would support this process to get us from the previous indicators to the new NPIs to start in October. And so in this process, like I said, we focused on the one Department of Housing, and they see as a part of their stabilization mission as a department, they support rapid rehousing models, they support people in prevention of homelessness and trying to help people stay housed, stay employed, et cetera, providing stability. We have some programs around helping with utilities, helping with landlord issues, resolution and conflict resolution. We have tenant counseling. We actually give tenant counseling rights and landlord right type training and resources for the people in the community. And then the wrap you see above there is the hub program, like I said, for our continuum of care, homeless networks, resource center. And so that group of people talked pretty extensively around the areas that they saw in those 13 dimensions. And one thing that we talked about was, how do we try to help people move in that, if you go back to the theory of change conversation, are we being effective at trying to help people feel empowered to engage and become community members? We know we are identically reporting our housing outputs, which the housing outputs as you probably know, they're tied specifically in support HUD and homeless programs around people obtaining and remaining in permanent housing, et cetera. And we also knew that we were doing an extensive amount around income. While we might have been collecting it, those 4 or 5 programs you saw there, we might have been collecting it in different ways, in which one program was asking for net income, one was asking for gross income, one was asking for non-cash benefits, et cetera. We knew we had the information. And then they identified in the question, you know, we don't know that we know that we're helping people feel empowered and supporting them in expansion necessarily of their social networks, or do they feel connected, or do they believe that they can start to impact and make changes in their own lives independent, and whether they want to participate in supporting the community. And the reason why is because we looked at and went through a process to try to determine what data we were using and what data we weren't asking. And so just as an example of the thought processes we went through together, we looked, for instance, this again is housing, and we looked at those indicators which happen to be identical to the MPI indicators. And we went through this physical process of saying, hey, you know, do we collect that? Yes. If we do, where is it? Some of it was HMIS information that we were uploading it. Some of it was from our client track system. Some of it was in an Excel spreadsheet. Some of it was in Access being reported by different types of fields. And we talked about a lot came out of that conversation. The growth of support around combining databases and doing the technology supports and being able to know whether we actually are collecting it consistently between different programs that are putting it in different spaces. And so we also looked, just for instance, this is just data we looked at for our trending on our permanent housing outputs. And this is one of those exercises that when we looked at it, we realized that those different lenses, the the housing coordinators that were directly working with the families knew more information about what you see there. They knew the context behind those numbers, and they knew what idiosyncrasies are included sometimes in information that's captured. For instance, if you look at this slide, it looks a little confusing when you look at race unknown, for instance. It says 100%. But really what that's saying is that there are many people who do not report their race, and they still were successful in their maintenance of permanent housing. That's how I would read that. But part of that is this is a particular area where discussion just actually got really robust, because we are reporting based upon census categories. And we know that the census categories are very explicit in, for instance, the 5 categories. There's Caucasian, and actually their people of color are the other 4, which is African American, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American. And for many of the people we serve, for instance, who are coming from Afghanistan or Syria or the Ukraine or Chile or Central America, they don't see themselves there, and they report other, or they don't report. And so in having a rich conversation with the people who know the details around the data, it becomes much more contextualized, and then we have ways in which we can look at strategies around those individual populations. So we came together and we made some recommendations. Part of those recommendations included, as you saw, those 4 dimensions that particular department chose. They came back with a request that the team that we had created for the Futures Pilot remain involved with the department and remain involved in the process of going through and do a detailed mapping of the areas of the dimensions with the NPI adoption, and work with them to make sure that they had data conversations available to them. They continued to have these types of meetings because they found them very powerful, and that they continue to have some support to work through any recommendations they may make to the database. And we agreed that we would do that, and we asked of them that they would also continue to try to confirm up what they wanted to come out of those dimensions, specifically the ones around trying to create tools that we could then be asking those questions around, are we helping you improve your social networks? Do you feel more empowered in your own decision-making going forward? And so that we could add those going into October.
So full circle, we're coming back to, where do agencies discover their role in the national network or even in regional areas? Converting data into decision-making strategies. So how, in your opinion, how did this go, taking Futures Project approach and embedding that or testing it out within your agency?
I think one of the interesting things is once you opened up the opportunity and you asked direct service people, managers, supervisors of case managers, even property management people supporting like people in our housing units, and you ask them to start to look at the information their programs were creating, it changed their perspective and sort of demystified data into pieces of information that they had. And then the conversation around converting it was, how do we make sure it has all that contextual framework with it, and that people understand, in often cases, they understand that particular services environment, the community it's functioning in, the funding pressures it's functioning in, and then converting that into, we think with all of these components, we need to change the way we do X, Y, or Z, or we need to increase staff to make sure that we're meeting a particular need that's a gap. And that ended up being recommendations that then had actually a lot more support and accountability built into it because more people were making the decision and felt that their opinions were being heard, which was critical to them.
And so I'm going to ask this question. People are like, this is great, this is awesome, this is wonderful,
right.
But where did you find the time? Time seems to be that concept that we just are so busy all the time. Where did you find the time for all of it?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know about anybody out there, but we don't have any shortage of meetings. We really don't. We have weekly meetings, the case managers and supervisors. We have quarterly meetings of our managers and supervisors. We have monthly meetings of our strategic leadership team, which has our directors involved in it, and sometimes board members. We have resident meetings where we talk to the people living in our residential units, experiencing our services and homeless history. And so we tried to take it where there was already time allocated and then asked for, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, let's talk about this information, what do you think it says, and really try to get and garner those inputs, and then we made sure that we got back to the people we talked to. I think that's a big thing, is making sure you loop back into saying, this is what we thought you said, did we hear you correctly? And how would you want us to phrase this, or what is the verbiage you think is important and relevant to use going up to where decisions are being made?
So looping back, then, how do you feel the future's dimensions fit throughout all of this?
They were actually a very, what I consider, uncomplicated structure. It was something in which everyone, no matter whether they were highly involved in the inner workings of a program or not, could speak from. And the indicators, in this case, what I call sort of the aspirational indicators around figuring out ways to ask and follow up around the mindset, growth mindset dimension and the social networking dimension. There was so much excitement about the fact that we would be asking the people we're serving to a greater degree whether we are actually helping them feel like they can enter the community and engage the community, which to me is actually asking them questions that then later we can say, we think we're making a community impact. We're building capacity within individuals, because we know that because they're telling us that. And I think, so it's a different way to talk about things. Our data didn't necessarily change, other than the aspirational conversation around those additional 2 dimensions we chose that we want to start reporting in going forward that convert to NPIs and will help us with that transition. But really, it is about talking differently with a lot more people about the work that you're doing already. And it's really the people who are doing the work. They're just doing it either as a direct service with the client every day, or they're the Megan persona representing inner management, or they're the directors who are wanting to ensure that we really are deepening client voice all the time in the way we make decisions.
Well, thank you, Kim. I really appreciate your perspective here today. I think we're learned so much. I did, for sure. And so that's really the end of our presentation today. Thank you for joining, and we have some time for questions and answers if there are any that came up during our extended time of talking.
Thank you very much. So we certainly want to encourage our listeners to go ahead and put questions in the chat window, or question and answer window. And it looks like we have some coming. No, we don't have any coming in. I'm sorry, we don't have any. We thought we did. And so with that said, maybe I have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about the learning community approach and maybe what the challenges have been with that approach in terms of like keeping, every level of the agency engaged? So can you just explain that framework again in ways in which you are able to keep all levels of the agency involved in that process to kind of move the needle forward?
Sure. So one of the things that we did is we went through the process of saying, what is a learning community? What does that environment actually look like? It sounds good, but how do we make sure that it has components that, one, make it effective, and two, make it something that people will want to continue to participate in? And so, for instance, one of them is what was to create it as a safe space, meaning that, if I'm a case manager and I'm sitting in the room with my director, do I feel comfortable giving my true opinion about what I think is happening without thinking that there's going to be recourse or that there's a power dynamic situation there? And so that safe space requirement, also that you create a way in which the comments that are interjected and the summary information is put out with it not being really identified, because every person's voice should be represented as equal value. And so then to try to create that is to look at the ways in which you have respectful dialogue, the rules of ways in which you make it so that everyone can attend, including sometimes if you have people who work night shifts or work, graveyard shifts. And so we went through the process of trying to really create that and hear that, and if it was going to be successful, everyone needs to feel equally valued, and that all the components of the way we carry it out demonstrate that. And I think that projected us forward, and it seems like if we truly create sort of a cultural shift towards that, it's interesting because people become actually more participatory.
Thank you very much. And, I think that whole notion of mobilizing one's agency towards that cultural shift that sort of creates that atmosphere of one's continual learning, but also, like you said, that respectful engagement, so that all voices kind of play into the thought and decision-making process. Is vital, and it's really a conversation that we are wanting to turn more and more outward to our network to, think about in a meaningful way. So it's helpful to hear that you all have talked about it. We have other examples within the Learning Communities Resource Center where agencies have talked about that openly, but we recognize that is a process that it takes time, it's complex, but in terms of really seeking to maximize impact on that local level, that is a necessary aspect of the process and conversation, so we appreciate you offering that. So our next question is the Futures Project a variation of the Bridges and Getting Ahead programs that have been used around the country and internationally?
Well, I would comment that the Futures Project is definitely a process. It's not definitely a tool. It's a philosophy and an understanding, and it's a way of bringing together again this learning aspect, this continuous learning in an organic and creative way, in a way that it's really hearing the voices and what's the need within each agency rather than being prescriptive in any manner. So the idea here is that each agency has control, and they are able to pave their own path. They're just using 13 dimensions of poverty as a vector towards meeting their own goals. But not only meeting their own goals, but being able to come to the table and have a conversation perhaps even throughout a state or even a tri-state area, and being able to and be able to learn from one another. I think really that learning aspect is really important, but it's from learning from different perspectives and learning from one another in that organic and creative way, but also having that structure, having enough structure in order to understand impact and then move forward from there.
Thank you. So the next question is, are there guidelines for incorporating the Futures project that an organization can use? You all want to talk about that, or you want me to talk about it?
Well, why don't you go ahead and we'll fill in support.
Yeah, and so so this is a part of a series of presentations that the Learning Communities Resource Center is offering to the CSBG network, and so all members of the network have access to the slide presentations and the recorded videos. In addition to that, the project is working on a toolkit which really kind of gets at aspects of the how-tos that we are planning to release to the network later this fall. So folks can be on the lookout just for some more specific or technical information on how this process has worked for the Futures Project. And like I said, we will make that available to the network through the LCRC. So we'll just stay tuned for that. I don't know if you all want to add any more.
Sure. So, you know, in moving forward, this was just the first cycle, so we're hoping to move into the second and third cycles in testing the indicators of the 13 dimensions. So in moving forward, we're still trying to design and see what aspects have been working, but we did it through a framework of guiding through a learning tool that was online. We were referring to it as an online learning program, which allowed each individual agency to communicate with one another in an interface, but also allowed them to go do it through weekly types of modules. So really that was a way of bringing about the learning community and guiding and facilitating, and in moving forward, having a facilitator in the region that also helps with technical assistance if there's any questions that came up along the way. So agencies are going through this process together, but are actually able to garner feedback from one another. And so this is not only just, I should say, it's not only just through online, but there's face-to-face meetings. We had two face-to-face interactions in Portland throughout the pilot. And here in the first part, it was for designing what was the tools to be used for Futures for what we were testing. And then the second one was to actually finish the program. Part of it was face-to-face. Again, talking about feedback, helping one another and communicating about what was learned. But then we took another day to get feedback and for evaluation purposes in this. That was pretty much the full. And so moving forward, we're hoping to actually, during the iterative process, we're hoping to make the modifications that we got from the feedback from our first 6 sites, and then move forward with new sites while supporting the sites that are already using the program.
And as a site who participated in that, one of the things I liked about it is that all 4 members of my team, which one was a direct service case manager, one was a mid-level manager, one person was the actual data person serving and supporting that department that had multiple programs and actually already had all their data format and the way in which they were required to report to the funders they had, and then myself. And I got to be able to be a learner as well as facilitating my team. And I can tell you that all four of them going through the learning module individually and having the opportunity to just give their input, their comments, their gut reactions, their needs that they weren't finding in the online module or in the technical assistance that was supporting it, was really valuable, and it made, again, this principle that all voices are the same, and that the tools need to meet the needs of all the levels of the organization in order for it to actually be adopted and valued, I think.
All right, so that is going to wrap up our session today. So thank you very much, Kim and Brent, for your presentations. We learned a lot, so thank you. And at this time, I'm going to pass the baton over to my colleague, Hyacinth McKinley, who's going to finish with our final announcements for today.
All right, so thank you very much, Tiffany. A big thanks again to both of our presenters, Kim and Brent, for walking us through part 2 of your series with us. Hopefully this piques everyone's interest for the continuation of these series, which you can see here on the slide, if I can get it to change. Give me just a second. Okay, there it is. So there are the other 2 remaining presentations in this series, and the next one is going to be taking place on September 18th, where they're going to be talking about the how. So building on the conversations for today, they're going to be talking a little bit about putting all of these metrics and processes into practice and talking about some of the results and the changes that they've seen in their work. So very exciting. Please go ahead and mark your calendars. And then, of course, the conclusion of this webinar series is going to take place shortly after that on September 27th, where they're going to continue on in that conversation. Again, we just wanted to provide you with some information on other upcoming national webinar series from the learning community. Our next one is going to be on July 25th, and that's going to be Health Intersections Session 4, where they're actually going to be talking about a very interesting topic, food access and nutrition, and how it ties into the work of community action. So we're very excited about that presentation. Hopefully many of you on the line today can join us for that. We very much appreciate your feedback. If you could take just a moment to fill out this survey, just give us your thoughts and opinions on what was discussed today. I'm sure our presenters would love that feedback, so if you could just take a few moments to do that. We really do try to incorporate your feedback into our future presentations, so please take just a few minutes to do so. Finally, here you will see the contact information for myself, but also everyone else on the training and technical assistance staff here at the partnership. Please feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions, concerns, comments that you might have, and we'll be able to answer your question or direct you to the person who might be able to best assist you. So please don't be afraid to say hello and send us your questions. And finally, a shameless plug for our upcoming annual convention, which is going to be taking place in Philadelphia this year on August 29th through September 1st. The folks in the Futures Project are actually going to be presenting for us there, kind of doing a wrap-up of their work as they're nearing the end of their project cycle. That's going to be ending the next month in October, but if you're interested in learning more and also hearing more about other things that have been going on in the learning community for this year, please be sure to join us in Philly. So with that, that's going to conclude our presentation for today. Thank you again to our presenters, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. So have a good day. Thanks.